It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Brianna Vance laughed, the sound sharp and brittle, as she pointed a manicured finger at Elena's sensible wool coat in the middle of the crowded gala foyer. Is that from the clearance rack, Elle? I didn't realize the tech world was hitting such a recession. The surrounding guests, a sea of silk and tailored tuxedos, paused their conversations to glance over. Elena felt the familiar prickle of heat on her neck, but she kept her expression as flat as a dead pixel. She took a slow sip of her sparkling water, the cold condensation chilling her palm. Beside Brianna, Richard Vance adjusted his silk tie, his eyes avoiding Elena's as he offered a small, enabling chuckle. "Don't be so sensitive, Elena," Richard said, his voice booming with a performative heartiness that set her teeth on edge. "Your sister is just worried about the family image. This is a Thorn event. Appearance is everything." Brianna smoothed the skirt of her shimmering gold gown, a dress Elena knew for a fact was a rental, the hidden return tag likely tucked beneath the left armpit. Brianna's perfume, a cloying, oversaturated floral scent that cost $400 an ounce, filled the space between them. She leaned in, her eyes gleaming with a predatory light. "I'm just saying," Brianna whispered, loud enough for the nearby socialites to hear. "It's embarrassing. You live in that tiny, fortress-like house in the suburbs while Marcus and I are out here actually building a brand. People are starting to ask if you're the help." Marcus Thorne stepped into the circle then, his smile too wide and his watch too heavy for his thin wrist. He draped an arm over Brianna's shoulder, the two of them a perfect portrait of least luxury. "Give her a break, babe," Marcus said, though his eyes were cold. "Not everyone is cut out for the high life. Some people are just born to be behind the scenes." Elena looked at the three of them, the sister who lived on credit, the father who traded his integrity for a seat at the table, and the boyfriend who was one bad investment away from a prison cell. They saw a quiet woman in a modest coat. They didn't see the woman who had spent the last decade building the backbone of the city's most secure data infrastructures. They didn't see the woman who held federal clearance. "I'm comfortable where I am," Elena said, her voice a calm, steady blade. "Of course you are," Brianna sneered, pulling a sleek, gold-cased smartphone from her designer clutch. "Which is why I decided to help you out a little. I know you're always so private about your work, but I figured a little exposure wouldn't hurt. I found that old laptop of yours in the guest room when I stopped by to borrow your steamer yesterday." Elena's heart didn't skip a beat. It slowed down. A cold, calculated stillness settled over her. "You went into my home while I was at the office." "The spare key is under the planter, Elle. It's not a state secret." Brianna rolled her eyes, her thumbs flying across her screen. "Anyway, your password was pathetic. Your cat's name. Really? I logged in to see if I could find some photos for a throwback post, but I found those encrypted folders instead. I had Marcus's tech guy take a look. We thought maybe you were hiding some family inheritance you hadn't mentioned." Richard Vance leaned in, his interest suddenly sharpened by the mention of money. "Elena, if there's family capital involved—" "There isn't," Elena interrupted, her eyes locked on Brianna. "What did you do, Brianna?" Brianna smirked, showing the screen to the group. It was a live stream notification. "I shared a few of those boring security contracts on my story. I told my followers my genius sister was finally opening up. The engagement is through the roof. You should thank me. You're finally interesting." Elena felt the world tilt, not with fear, but with the sudden, violent realization of what Brianna had actually done. Those weren't just contracts. They were the schematics for the Thorne estate's internal security grid. The very systems Elena had been hired to audit under a strict, non-disclosure agreement with the federal government. The silence that followed was broken only by the rhythmic clack-clack of Brianna's acrylic nails as she refreshed her comments. "Oh, look," Brianna giggled, oblivious to the digital landslide she had just triggered. "Someone just commented that the admin login you have saved in your browser actually works. They're saying they're looking at the house's floor plan right now. Isn't that wild?" Elena reached into her coat pocket and felt the cool, brushed steel of her encrypted mobile device. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She simply turned her back on the gold-leaf disaster that was her sister. She walked toward the quiet corner of the foyer, her boots silent on the marble. With 3 swift taps, she activated the scythe protocol, a silent alarm she had built into her own systems for exactly this scenario. A notification flashed on her screen, unauthorized login detected. Source, internal, biometric override engaged, trace commenced. She looked back at Brianna, who was currently posing for a selfie with Marcus, both of them grinning at a camera while the digital world began to tear their lives apart. Brianna didn't know that the admin account she had exposed was a honeypot, a trap designed to flag any unauthorized user to federal authorities immediately. Elena felt a strange, cold peace. She had spent years protecting these people from their own shadows, but the shadows were finally coming home. She pressed a final command on her screen, her thumb steady. "Detective Miller," Elena said quietly into the phone as she watched her father laugh at one of Marcus's jokes. "I need to report a high-level data breach, and I have the names of the primary suspects." She ended the call and tucked the phone away. The gala was still loud, the champagne was still flowing, and the lights were still bright. But as Elena walked toward the exit, she knew the countdown had already reached 0. Behind her, Brianna's phone let out a sharp, discordant chime, the sound of 1,000 notifications arriving all at once. The game hadn't just changed, it was over. Elena didn't look back. She had a vault to secure and a family to erase. The next morning, the sun bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Vance estate, but the atmosphere inside was frigid. Elena stepped into the breakfast nook, her footsteps silent on the reclaimed oak floors. The scent of over-roasted espresso and Brianna's cloying, synthetic vanilla perfume hung heavy in the air, a sensory assault that signaled a long night of frantic damage control. Richard Vance sat at the head of the mahogany table, his face a mask of mottled crimson. He didn't look up from his tablet, where a red ticker tape of stock devaluations flickered like a warning light. Beside him, Brianna was hunched over her phone, her thumb flying across the screen as she deleted comments in a desperate, losing battle against the digital tide. Her limited edition, silk robe was frayed at the cuffs, a small crack in the veneer of the luxury she worked so hard to project. "You're late," Richard snapped, finally meeting Elena's gaze. He slammed the tablet onto the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Do you have any idea what your security report did to our holdings this morning? The firm is down 12%. Brianna's main sponsor just paused her contract." "I reported a high-level data breach, Father," she replied, her voice as calm as a frozen lake. She poured herself a glass of water, feeling the cold condensation bite into her palm. "As the head of security for Vance Global, it was my legal obligation. If Marcus was using Brianna's credentials to bypass federal encryption, the liability." "Don't you dare say his name like that," Brianna shrieked, her voice cracking. She stood up, her chair screeching against the floor. She looked at her sister with a pure, unadulterated loathing that made the air feel thick. "Marcus was trying to help me. He was optimizing the back end of the family accounts because you were too busy with your government secrets to care about us. You're just jealous because I actually have a following. You're nothing but a bank account with a pulse to this family, and now you've broken the bank." Elena took a slow sip of water. The audacity was breathtaking. They weren't just enablers, they were co-conspirators in their own destruction. She felt a phantom vibration in her pocket, a message from Detective Sarah Miller confirming that the digital trail Marcus had left was wide enough for a freight train to pass through. "I need you to sign this," Richard said, sliding a thick legal folder across the table. His tone had shifted from rage to a manipulative, oily smoothness. "It's a retroactive authorization. It says Marcus was acting under your direct supervision as a consultant. It clears him, it clears the firm, and it stops the federal inquiry." Elena glanced at the document. It wasn't just an authorization. It was a confession of negligence that would strip her of her security clearance and hand her entire personal portfolio over to the family trust as collateral. It was a ransom note for her life's work. "And if I don't?" she asked quietly. Brianna leaned over the table, her eyes narrowed. "Then we tell the board that you orchestrated the breach yourself to tank the stock and buy more shares at a discount. We've already seeded the story with my PR team. In an hour, the world will know that Elena Vance is a corporate saboteur." The betrayal was complete. They had spent the night sharpening the knife they intended to put in her back. Elena felt a strange, cold thrill. They had no idea that the family trust they were so eager to protect was already a hollow shell. "The board meeting is in 3 days," she said, closing the folder without signing it. "The annual audit is scheduled for Friday morning. I suggest you both prepare your statements very carefully." "Is that a threat?" Richard growled, his hand tightening around his coffee cup until his knuckles turned white. "It's a countdown," she replied. As she turned to leave, the heavy front doors swung open. Marcus Thorne stepped into the foyer, his designer suit rumpled and his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. He looked at Brianna, then at Richard, and finally his gaze landed on Elena. The smug arrogance he'd worn at the gala was gone, replaced by a raw, jagged desperation. "The accounts are locked," Marcus rasped, his voice trembling. "Elena, what did you do? My offshore access is gone, all of it." She didn't answer. She simply walked past him, the rhythmic click of her heels the only sound in the sudden, suffocating silence of the room. Behind her, she heard the first notes of a frantic argument break out, but she was already miles away, mentally checking the final locks on the vault they had tried so hard to pick. The game was no longer about protection. It was about the inevitable, crushing weight of the fall. 2 days later, the sterile hum of the precinct offered a clarity that the Vance family estate never could. Elena Vance sat across from Detective Sarah Miller, watching the older woman's eyes scan the data scrolling across a dual-monitor setup. The office smelled of industrial-grade lemon cleaner and the bitter, burnt scent of a coffee pot that had been on since dawn. Sarah leaned back, the springs of her chair groaning in the silence. "You're sure about this?" Sarah asked, her voice a low rasp. "Once I submit this drive to the fraud division, there's no pulling it back. Marcus Thorne isn't just a petty thief. The federal signatures on these accounts suggest he's been moving money for people who don't take kindly to being locked out." Elena didn't blink. Her back remained a straight line against the hard plastic chair. "He didn't just move money, Sarah. He tried to use my security credentials to bypass the federal firewall on my private contracts. He didn't just steal from the family. He put my clearance at risk. He's a liability I'm no longer willing to carry." The detective nodded, her expression grim. She tapped a finger on the desk, the rhythmic sound echoing the ticking of the clock on the wall. "We've been tracking the liability for 6 months, but we lacked the bridge between his digital aliases and his physical location. This drive is that bridge. It's the weapon we needed." Elena felt a cold surge of satisfaction. It wasn't the heat of anger, but the chill of a calculated victory. She had spent 48 hours meticulously documenting every cent Marcus had siphoned, every forged signature Richard Vance had provided to facilitate the theft, and every gift Brianna had accepted with a smile. "Keep me informed," Elena said, standing up. The sound of her modest, sensible shoes on the linoleum was firm and decisive. "I have a feeling the next 24 hours will be very loud for the rest of my family." "Elena," Sarah called out as she reached the door. "Be careful. Arrogant men become dangerous when they realize the quiet one was the one holding the keys the whole time." When Elena pulled into her driveway an hour later, the sight of a rented, neon-wrapped sports car blocking her garage didn't surprise her. Brianna Vance was leaning against the hood, her phone held high as she recorded a video, her face a mask of performative distress for her followers. The smell of her cloying, expensive perfume, the kind that came in a bottle shaped like a stiletto, hit Elena before she even stepped out of her car. "And here she is, guys," Brianna said into the camera, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "The sister who thinks she can just glitch our family out of our own lives. Say hi to the fans, Elena. Elena ignored the phone, walking toward her front door. The brushed steel of the security keypad felt cold under her fingertips. She entered a code, and the heavy door hissed open with a hydraulic sigh. "Turn that off, Brianna," Elena said, her voice flat. "Or what?" Brianna snapped, dropping the phone to her side as the recording ended. Her face shifted instantly from victim to predator. She followed Elena into the foyer, her synthetic leather heels clicking sharply on the polished stone. "Marcus is losing his mind. Richard is drinking himself into a stupor because the mortgage on the estate is flagged. You think this is funny? You think playing God with the Wi-Fi is going to make us respect you?" Elena turned, her calm gaze catching Brianna off guard. "It isn't a glitch, and it isn't about respect. It's about the fact that you've been living in a house of cards, and I'm the one who owns the land it's built on." Brianna laughed, a harsh, entitled sound. "You own nothing. You're just a glorified IT girl. Dad was right. You're just a tool we use to keep the lights on so the rest of us can actually shine. Give Marcus the override codes, or I swear I'll tell every one of my followers that you're a cybercriminal. I'll ruin your precious reputation before the sun goes down." "You're so certain of your power," Elena mused, watching her sister. She noticed the slight tremor in Brianna's hand, the way she clutched her designer bag like a shield. "But you've forgotten one thing. You and Marcus have been spending money that was never yours. You've been flaunting leased luxury while I've been building a bastion." "I don't care about your metaphors," Brianna screamed, her composure finally shattering. "Fix it, now." Elena reached into her bag and pulled out a heavy, embossed card. It was the invitation to the Vance Legacy Auction, the high society event of the season where the family intended to sell off surplus assets to cover their debts. "I'll see you at the auction tomorrow night," Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a blade. "I hope you've picked out a very expensive dress, Brianna. It'll be the last thing people remember you in." "What is that supposed to mean?" Brianna demanded, her eyes narrowing. Elena didn't answer. She stepped back and pressed a button on the wall. The internal security shutters began to descend, a wall of reinforced steel sliding down to seal the foyer from the rest of the house. "It means," Elena said as the shutter reached chest height, "that the countdown has already hit 0. You just haven't heard the explosion yet." As the steel plate clicked into the floor, severing the connection between them, Elena looked down at her phone. A single message from Sarah Miller sat on the screen, warrant signed. "See you at the auction." Elena walked into her kitchen, the silence of her home wrapping around her like a shroud. She poured a glass of water, her hands perfectly steady. Tomorrow, the world would see the Vance family for exactly what they were. And for the first time in her life, Elena wouldn't be the one hiding in the shadows. She would be the one holding the light that burned it all down. The following afternoon, the grand ballroom of the Fairmont hummed with the polished clink of crystal and the heavy, cloying scent of lilies. It was the kind of room designed to make people feel important, a gilded cage for the city's elite to watch the Vance family auction off the excess of their estate. Elena stood near a marble pillar, her simple charcoal suit a sharp contrast to the sea of sequins and silk. She watched her sister, Brianna, glide through the crowd like a predator in a rented gown, her laughter echoing with a brittle, hollow ring that only Elena seemed to hear. Brianna spotted her and veered off course, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. She adjusted the heavy diamond necklace at her throat, a piece Elena knew was currently listed as missing in a police report filed 3 hours ago. "You actually showed up," Brianna said, her voice dripping with a performative pity that made the socialites nearby lean in. "I suppose even a tech hermit needs to see how the other half lives once in a while. Though honestly, Elena, that suit, it looks like you're here to fix the Wi-Fi, not attend a gala." A few of the surrounding guests chuckled. Elena didn't flinch. She took a slow sip of her mineral water, the cold glass a grounding weight in her hand. "The suit is functional, Brianna. Much like the security system you tried to bypass yesterday. Some things are built to last, while others are just gold-plated." Brianna's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before her mask of arrogance resettled. "Always so dramatic. It's just a house, Elena, and soon it won't even be yours. Dad's already talking to the developers about the land. Richard Vance appeared then, smelling of expensive bourbon and expensive lies. He draped a heavy arm over Brianna's shoulder, looking at Elena with the narrowed eyes of a man who viewed his daughter as a faulty piece of equipment. Don't start with her, Brianna. She's just bitter because she doesn't understand how real business works. It takes vision to turn a stagnant asset into liquid capital. Vision, Elena repeated softly. She looked past them to the back of the room, where Marcus Thorne was huddled with a group of investors, his eyes darting toward the entrance every few seconds. He looked like a man waiting for a floor to drop. Is that what you call it? I'd call it a gamble. And from where I'm standing, the house is about to win. Richard stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous hiss. I've had enough of your riddles. You're here as a guest of the family, nothing more. Keep your mouth shut and let the auction proceed, or I'll have security escort you to the curb where you belong. Elena tilted her head, her gaze shifting to the auctioneer who was just taking the stage. I'll give you one warning, Richard, just one. Check the digital signatures on those transfer deeds before the first lot goes up. Sometimes, when you think you've found a backdoor, you've actually just walked into a trap. Richard let out a sharp, mocking bark of laughter. A trap? From you? You spend your life behind a screen, Elena. You wouldn't know a real-world threat if it slapped you in the face. Stay in your lane. He turned his back on her, guiding Brianna toward the front row. They sat down with the casual confidence of people who believed their own lies, oblivious to the fact that the investors Marcus was talking to were actually plainclothes officers from Detective Sarah Miller's unit. Elena felt a vibration in her pocket. She pulled out her phone and saw a single notification. System override complete. All accounts frozen. Ready on your signal. She looked up. Across the room, Marcus Thorne caught her eye. For the first time that day, the arrogance drained from his face. He saw the phone in her hand, saw the calm, icy certainty in her expression, and he froze. He whispered something to Richard, pointing toward her, but her father just waved him off with a dismissive flick of his hand, his eyes fixed on the auctioneer's gavel. The room went quiet as the gavel struck the podium. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent ballroom. Ladies and gentlemen, the auctioneer began, his voice booming through the speakers Elena had personally rewired the night before. Welcome to the Vance estate liquidation. We shall begin with Lot 1, the Silicon Valley Holdings. Elena leaned back against the pillar, her thumb hovering over the send button on her screen. She watched her father lean over to whisper a joke to Brianna, both of them radiant in their stolen light. They hadn't heard the explosion yet, but the fuse was already gone. Going once, the auctioneer called out. Elena pressed the button. At the back of the room, the heavy oak doors opened, and Sarah Miller stepped into the light, a folder of warrants tucked firmly under her arm. Elena didn't look at the police. She kept her eyes on Brianna's profile, waiting for the exact moment the realization would hit. Going twice, the auctioneer continued, unaware that his digital display was about to change. Elena felt a strange, cold peace settle over her. She had warned them. She had given them the chance to stop. Now, all that was left was the gravity. The silence that followed the click of Elena's phone was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the grand ballroom. Seconds later, the high-definition screens flanking the auctioneer didn't show the expected portfolio of tech stocks or the deed to the Silicon Valley Holdings. Instead, a series of frozen bank statements appeared, highlighted in a jarring, neon red that cut through the soft amber lighting of the Vance estate. Elena Vance stood perfectly still against the marble pillar, her breath hitching only once as she watched the room's collective gaze shift from the auctioneer to the digital evidence of a decade of fraud. The scent of expensive lilies, usually so sweet, suddenly felt cloying and thick, like the air in a tomb. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked at her father. Richard Vance froze, his glass of vintage Bordeaux halfway to his lips. The wine trembled, the dark liquid catching the light like a pool of blood. He didn't look at the screens at first. He looked at the heavy oak doors where Detective Sarah Miller was already moving through the throng of socialites with the practiced, heavy-footed grace of someone who had spent 20 years chasing shadows. What is the meaning of this? Richard's voice boomed, though the usual ironclad authority was replaced by a brittle, high-pitched desperation. He slammed his glass onto a passing waiter's tray, the chime of crystal against silver ringing out like a funeral bell. This is a private event. Security, remove these people immediately. Sarah Miller didn't stop. She didn't even slow down. She held up a folder, the official seal of the district attorney's office visible to everyone in the front 3 rows. Richard Vance, I have a warrant for the seizure of all assets associated with Vance Global and its subsidiaries. I also have a warrant for your arrest on charges of wire fraud and grand larceny. A collective gasp rippled through the room, a sound like wind through dry leaves. Elena watched as the people who had been laughing at her father's jokes only minutes ago suddenly recoiled, physically pulling their chairs back as if his ruin were contagious. This is a mistake, Brianna Vance shrieked, stepping forward from the shadows of the VIP lounge. She was draped in a silk gown that cost more than most people's annual rent, her neck adorned with a diamond necklace she had borrowed from Elena's private safe 3 weeks prior. Do you have any idea who we are? I have 4 million people watching my live stream right now. You can't just walk in here and ruin my brand because of some technical glitch. The detective didn't even blink. She turned her gaze to Brianna, her expression as flat and cold as a slab of granite. Actually, Brianna, your brand is listed as a primary vehicle for the laundering of diverted corporate funds. You might want to put the phone down. Anything you broadcast is being recorded by my office in real time. Brianna's face went a sickly shade of gray, the heavy contouring on her cheeks suddenly looking like dirt against her pale skin. She looked down at her phone, her thumb hovering over the Go Live button, her lower lip trembling with a mixture of fury and genuine terror. Elena, she screamed, spinning around to find her sister. Do something. Tell them this is just one of your stupid security tests. Tell them you set this up. Elena stepped out from behind the pillar, the movement slow and deliberate. She felt the weight of the room's attention shift to her, a crushing pressure that she met with a spine of pure steel. She didn't look like the mousy daughter they all remembered. She looked like the architect of their destruction. I didn't set this up, Brianna, Elena said, her voice low but carrying to the very back of the hall. I just stopped hiding the truth. You spent years telling me I didn't belong in this family because I didn't care about the labels or the lights. You told me I was just the help with a high IQ. She walked toward the stage, her heels clicking against the marble with a rhythmic, predatory precision. Every eye followed her. She could see Marcus Thorne near the buffet, his eyes darting toward the side exit. He looked like a rat smelling smoke, his hand instinctively reaching for the pocket where he likely kept his burner phones. Elena, honey, Richard said, his voice dropping into that smooth, manipulative tone he used whenever he wanted a loan or a favor. He stepped toward her, his hands outstretched as if to embrace her. Let's go into the study. We can fix this. You know how the systems work. Just reset the display. We'll talk about your inheritance. We'll make it right. Elena stopped 3 feet from him. She could smell the expensive tobacco on his breath and the sweat breaking through his high-end cologne. It was the smell of a man who had finally run out of people to lie to. There is no inheritance, Dad, she said, her voice devoid of heat. There never was. You spent it all by 2018. Everything since then has been a pyramid scheme built on the backs of your employees' pension funds. And the house, the one you're standing in. She pulled a small, black remote from her pocket, a custom-engineered override for the home's smart system. I bought the debt on this estate 6 months ago through an anonymous holding company, she whispered, loud enough for the nearby board members to hear. You aren't the owner, Richard. You're a squatter. The color drained from his face so quickly Elena thought he might actually collapse. He reached out to grab her arm, his fingers clawing at her sleeve, but Sarah Miller was there in a heartbeat, her hand firm on his shoulder. Hands behind your back, Mr. Vance, the detective commanded. As the first metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the ballroom, Elena turned her gaze to Marcus. He had almost reached the service door, his movements frantic. She didn't have to say a word. 2 plainclothes officers stepped out from the kitchen, blocking his path. "Going somewhere, Marcus?" Elena asked, a cold, sharp smile finally touching her lips. The room erupted into chaos as the realization truly hit. The Vance estate liquidation was no longer a metaphor. It was a live execution of a dynasty. Elena leaned back against the stage, watching as the blue and red lights of the arriving patrol cars began to pulse against the stained glass windows, turning the ballroom into a kaleidoscope of impending justice. She checked her watch. 3 minutes until the servers at the district attorney's office received the final encryption key. Brianna was sobbing now, a loud, ugly sound that filled the gaps between the police orders. "Wait," Brianna gasped, clutching at a passing officer's sleeve. "My jewelry, this is mine. You can't take what's mine." "Actually," the officer said, checking his clipboard, "everything in this house is currently being cataloged as evidence, including the necklace." Elena watched as the diamonds were unclipped from her sister's neck. She felt a strange, hollow peace. It wasn't over yet, but the siege had begun, and for the first time in her life, Elena was the one holding the keys to the fortress. At the back of the hall, the heavy oak doors began to hiss shut, the automated security system Elena had designed finally engaging. No one was leaving until the truth was fully unraveled. Elena looked at the screen one last time, where the final slide was about to reveal the one secret her father had died to keep. The projector hummed, a low, predatory drone that cut through the frantic sounds of Brianna's sobbing. On the far wall, the white light coalesced into a high-resolution image of a legal document. It was a deed, stamped with the seal of the county recorder, but the name at the bottom wasn't the one anyone expected to see. "Elena, turn that off!" Richard Vance roared, his face a mottled purple as he stepped toward his daughter. He tried to grab her arm, but Detective Sarah Miller stepped between them, her hand resting firmly on her belt. "Stay back, Mr. Vance," the detective said, her voice a flat line of authority. "She's showing us the evidence we requested." Elena didn't look at her father. She didn't look at the police. She kept her eyes on the screen, her thumb hovering over the brushed aluminum remote. The cold air from the vents carried the sharp, bitter scent of scorched coffee from a cup Marcus Thorne had knocked over in his panic. "You always told me this house was the family legacy, Dad," Elena said, her voice echoing in the sudden, vacuum-like silence of the foyer. "You told Brianna it was her birthright. You let her treat it like a playground while you funneled my contributions into a trust I was never supposed to touch. Because it's mine," Brianna shrieked, her voice cracking. She stood in the center of the room, her designer dress wrinkled and her hair matted with sweat. "I made this place famous. My followers know every inch of this house. It's my brand." Elena clicked the remote. A bank ledger appeared, showing a foreclosure notice from 3 years ago, followed by a full cash purchase from a private holding company. "The bank took this house the year you retired, Dad," Elena said. "You lost it all, but the holding company that bought it, that's me. I've been your landlord for 36 months. Every maintenance fee you demanded from me was actually just you embezzling money to pay the rent I was secretly charging you." The silence that followed was absolute. Brianna's face didn't just change, it disintegrated. The practiced, influencer-perfect pout she'd maintained for years curdled into something unrecognizable. Her eyes, usually wide with performative innocence, shrank into frantic pinpricks of terror as she stared at the legal documents on the wall. The heavy foundation on her cheeks seemed to crack as her jaw dropped, her mouth hanging open in a silent, jagged O that made her look decades older. A sickly, gray pallor washed over her skin, starting at her hairline and chasing away the fake tan until she looked like a marble statue of grief. Her nostrils flared with every ragged, hitching breath, and a single, ugly vein throbbed in the center of her forehead, a pulsing rhythm of her world ending. Behind her, Marcus Thorne was already backing toward the kitchen, his eyes darting toward the servants' entrance. He knew a sinking ship when he saw one, and his meal ticket had just turned into a prison sentence. Mrs. Sterling, the neighbor who had spent the evening praising Brianna's exquisite taste, clutched her pearls so hard the strings snapped, the sound of beads hitting the marble floor like a volley of tiny gunshots. Even the caterer stood frozen by the buffet, a silver tray of hors d'oeuvres trembling in his hands as he watched the Vance dynasty implode. Richard staggered back, his hand searching for the mahogany sideboard for support. "Elena, we're family. You can't do this." "Family protects each other," she replied, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt louder than a shout. "You spent 20 years using me as a vault. You let Brianna steal my identity, my security clearances, and my peace of mind. You didn't just fail me, Richard. You hunted me." She clicked the remote one last time. The screen went black. The security system gave a final, satisfied chirp as the external gates locked, sealing the perimeter. Elena stepped toward the front door, the heels of her modest pumps clicking with a steady, funereal rhythm. She paused at the threshold, looking back at the wreckage of her childhood. Brianna was on her knees now, clawing at the rug as if she could find her lost status in the fibers. "You wanted to live like a queen, Brianna," Elena said, her hand on the heavy brass handle. "You forgot that queens are only as powerful as the land they own. And you're trespassing." She stepped out into the cool night air, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind her with a final, echoing thud. Behind her, the blue and red lights of the police cruisers began to pulse against the windows, illuminating the end of the only life her sister had ever known. Elena didn't look back. She had a new home to go to, one where the locks were hers and hers alone. The strobe of blue and red lights painted the manicured lawn in rhythmic, violent pulses, turning the white picket fences of the neighborhood into a flickering crime scene. Elena Vance stood on the sidewalk, the chill of the evening air finally seeping through her coat, though she felt strangely insulated by the silence of the street. Behind her, the heavy oak doors she had just locked remained a silent barrier between her past and her future. Brianna Vance burst through the side entrance a moment later, her voice a shrill, jagged thing that cut through the neighborhood's quiet. "She's insane. Arrest her. She's trapped us in there and she's stolen my property." Her designer heels caught on the uneven gravel of the driveway, the same gravel she'd always complained was too common for her aesthetic, and she stumbled toward the first officer she saw. Her breath hitched in frantic, shallow gasps, her chest heaving under the silk of a blouse that cost more than a month of Elena's mortgage. Detective Sarah Miller didn't move. She stood with her feet planted and a clipboard in one hand, looking at the hysterical woman with a gaze of weary professional boredom. "Miss Vance, we're not here for your sister," she said, her voice a flat, grounding anchor against the chaos. She stepped past the shouting woman, her eyes locked on the man trying to slip quietly toward the back of the property. "Marcus Thorne, you're under arrest for multiple counts of identity theft and felony wire fraud." "Put your hands where I can see them." Brianna's face didn't just fall. It seemed to physically collapse under the weight of the strobe lights. The mask of the untouchable influencer shattered, leaving behind a frantic, hollow-eyed woman whose skin had turned the color of wet ash. Her jaw hung slack, her lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, uncontrollable twitch that ruined the symmetry she spent thousands to maintain. Her eyes darted from the handcuffs to the detective, then finally to Elena, filling with a desperate, ugly realization that the sister she had treated as a bank account was now the only person with the power to stop the metal from closing around her wrists. Every ounce of her least luxury seemed to weigh her down, the heavy designer jewelry suddenly looking like gilded shackles before the real ones even touched her skin. "Wait, no," she stammered, her voice losing its edge and becoming a thin, pathetic whine. "Marcus is an investor. He's going to fix everything. Elena, tell them he's with us." She reached out, her manicured nails clawing at the air as if she could grab onto the status that was evaporating in real time. Richard Vance stepped into the light then, his face a deep, mottled red. He ignored his daughter's sobbing, his focus narrowing on Elena with the practiced aggression of a man used to getting his way through sheer volume. "Fix this, Elena. Right now. I don't know what kind of game you're playing with the police, but you're embarrassing this family. Call your contacts. Tell them this is a misunderstanding before this goes any further." He took a step toward her, his hand raised in a familiar, commanding gesture. "I am the one who called them, Dad," she said, her voice so calm it seemed to suck the air out of his lungs. She didn't flinch as he stopped mid-stride. "And I'm not playing a game. I'm closing an account." The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. Richard looked at her as if she had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. He looked at the police, then at the zip ties being tightened around Marcus Thorne's wrists. The realization hit him slowly. The gravy train hadn't just stalled, the tracks had been demolished. His shoulders, usually puffed out with unearned pride, slumped forward. He looked at the house, then back at the daughter he had spent years dismissing. You'd do this to your own blood, over money." "No," she replied, pulling a small, encrypted drive from her pocket and handing it to the detective. "I'm doing it for the truth. Those logs contain every transfer Marcus made from my accounts into Brianna's business funds and every authorization you signed to facilitate it. It's all there. Every cent you thought was yours." Detective Sarah Miller took the drive with a nod. "We have the digital trail, Elena. We'll take it from here." She turned back to the others. "Richard Vance, Brianna Vance, you'll both need to come with us for questioning. Don't bother looking for the keys. This property is being seized as part of the investigation into Mr. Thorne's assets." The sound of the first pair of handcuffs clicking shut was the most satisfying thing Elena had ever heard. It was a small, metallic sound, but it echoed against the brick of the house like a gavel. Brianna began to wail, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror as the reality of a cold cell replaced the dream of a marble foyer. She looked at Elena one last time, her eyes begging for the mercy she had never once shown. Elena didn't offer it. She didn't stay to watch them be loaded into the back of the cruisers. She turned toward her own car, a modest, reliable vehicle that she actually owned. As she pulled away from the curb, she caught one last glimpse in the rearview mirror, the red and blue lights fading, the house she had once loved standing dark and empty, and the people who had tried to break her finally facing the weight of their own choices. She had a new life to start, and for the first time in years, the only person she had to take care of was herself. 6 months had passed since the blue and red strobe lights had ceased to bounce off the brickwork of the Vance family home. For Elena, the time had been measured not in days, but in the absence of noise. There were no more shrill demands for money, no more thudding bass from Marcus Thorne's late-night parties, and no more of Brianna's performative shrieking into a smartphone camera. Elena stood on the edge of a sprawling construction site in Northern Virginia, the scent of fresh-turned earth and ionized air from a nearby substation filling her lungs. She adjusted the strap of her laptop bag, feeling the weight of the encrypted drive inside. This was her latest project, a Tier 4 data center for a federal agency that didn't officially exist. She was no longer the quiet sister hiding in the basement. She was the lead architect of a fortress. "The perimeter sensors are live, Elena," a technician called out, nodding to her with genuine respect. She checked the tablet in her hand. The interface was clean, a digital web of her own design. "Good. Bring the biometric gates online. I want this place invisible by sunset." Her life had become a series of secure layers, each one more impenetrable than the last. She had moved into a townhouse that looked unremarkable from the street, but featured reinforced steel framing and a dedicated server room that monitored every square inch of the property. It was the stealth wealth she had always preferred, now weaponized for her own peace of mind. A sharp buzz at her hip broke her focus. It was a secure line. "Elena Vance," she said, her voice steady and devoid of the tremor that used to define her. "It's Detective Sarah Miller. I wanted to give you the final update before the files are moved to long-term storage." Elena stepped away from the hum of the machinery, looking out over the skeleton of the new building. "I'm listening, Detective." "Marcus Thorne was sentenced this morning," Miller said, her tone professional but softened by a hint of satisfaction. "With his prior warrants and the identity theft charges you provided, The judge gave him 12 years in a federal facility. He won't be bothering anyone for a long time. And my sister? Elena asked. The word sister felt like a relic from a language she no longer spoke. Brianna Vance began her 3-year sentence at the State Correctional Center yesterday. Her appeal for probation was denied. The judge wasn't particularly moved by her claims that she was a victim of influence. Most of her followers have moved on to the next scandal, though a few are still picking apart the fraud evidence you leaked. Elena felt a cold, sharp spark of catharsis. She pictured Brianna in a drab, gray jumpsuit, stripped of her designer filters and leased luxury. There were no ring lights in a state cell, and no one cared about her follower count when it was time for lights out. The parasite had finally run out of hosts. And Richard Vance? Elena asked, her voice dropping an octave. Your father is still in that studio apartment in the city, Miller replied. He's called the station 4 times this week trying to find out where you moved. We've told him the same thing every time. There is a permanent restraining order in place. If he steps within 500 feet of your registered addresses, he goes straight to a cell. Thank you, Sarah, for everything. Elena ended the call and tucked the phone away. She thought of Richard, the man who had viewed her as a sentient ATM. He was likely sitting in a cramped room right now, staring at a mounting pile of bills he couldn't pay, wondering why his sleeping lion of a daughter had finally bitten back. He had enabled Brianna's greed until it consumed them both, and now he was left with the silence he had always feared. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Elena drove back toward the city. She stopped at a small, quiet cemetery on the outskirts. She didn't visit a grave. She sat on a bench near the back, looking at the trees. The cost of her victory was a heavy, hollow thing. She had won. She had her wealth, her career, and her safety. But she had also confirmed that the people who shared her blood were the very ones who would have seen her destroyed for a few thousand likes and a rented sports car. She had traded the illusion of a family for the reality of a fortress. Arriving at her townhouse, Elena didn't fumble for keys. She placed her palm against the discreet scanner by the door. A soft, musical chirp signaled the disarming of the alarm. The house was cool, smelling of sandalwood and expensive paper. She walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, watching the security feed on a recessed monitor. A dark sedan drove past her house without slowing down. The system tagged the plate, checked it against a white list, and cleared it. She was safe. The perimeter was secure. Elena sat in the twilight of her living room, the silence no longer a threat, but a shield. She had built a world where no one could hurt her again, even if it meant she was the only one left inside it. She took a slow breath, the air clean and earned, and finally let the last ghost of the Vance family fade into the dark.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.